As of 2019, the average amount of time that a condemned individual spends between their trial and execution is about 22 years. Sometimes it's significantly shorter than that, and other times it's more than twice that length. But regardless of the amount of time that it takes, in the end, all these individuals have one thing in common, and that's their right to select one final meal of their choice. I've shared about 40 of these meals thus far, and in this video, I'm going to be sharing 20 more. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for the support, and I hope you enjoy part 3 of my Death Row meal rankings. I'm ranking every Death Row final meal request to find out which one's the greatest of all time. Today, we are taking a look at the selection of Juanita the Duchess Spinelli. In 1940 San Francisco, Spinelli was a gang leader who was known to pick up young homeless men off the streets. And in exchange for housing and feeding them, Spinelli would have these boys train under her to become professional criminals. And eventually, Spinelli had two of her protégés, Albert Ives and Robert Sherrod, perform a robbery in which they ended up shooting and killing a man. But because Spinelli feared Sherrod would confess this to the police, she proceeded to poison him, have the gang beat him while he was unconscious, and threw him over a bridge. But fearing the same would happen to him, Ives escaped and confessed to the police himself. And when Spinelli was finally caught, she was sentenced to death by asphyxiation gas. For her final meal, Spinelli requested turkey meat and a hamburger. In my opinion, this meal is a bit below average in basically every regard. I'm placing this meal in C tier. Today, we're taking a look at the selection of Russell Bucklew. On Valentine's Day of 1996, Bucklew's girlfriend Stephanie Ray broke up with him and they went their separate ways. But when Bucklew began to stalk their old trailer, he found that Ray was with the new man, Michael Sanders. So after threatening the pair multiple times, he eventually went on to break into their trailer, dual-wielding pistols, gunned down Sanders, and fired a shot at one of his children, but missed. Also, Bucklew kidnapped Ray as he fled the scene. However, he was quickly tracked down and was captured and sentenced to death by lethal injection. For his final meal, Bucklew requested 2 chili cheese dogs, a bacon cheeseburger, a sausage and pepperoni pizza, a bucket of fried chicken, fried fish with tartar sauce, a pound of barbecue, a pint of ice cream, and a 6-pack of Coca-Cola. In my opinion, this meal had tons of variety, plenty of quantity, and was chocked full of comforting dishes. I'm placing this meal in S tier. Today, we're taking a look at the selection of Dobie Gillis Williams. On the night of July 8th, 1984, Sonia Nippers woke up in the middle of the night to use the bathroom. However, when she closed the door, she discovered a pantless man brandishing a knife. Then, as she screamed in horror, the assailant stabbed her to death and fled out the window. As a result of this crime, Williams was sentenced to death by lethal injection. However, issues with this case quickly began to arise. Not only was Williams considered mentally disabled with an IQ of 65, but also, the lawyer that represented him in trial ended up being disbarred for incompetence. And his sentencing was even eventually overturned. But due to his mitigating evidence being introduced too late into the case, Williams was still executed. For his final meal, Williams requested 12 chocolate bars and ice cream. In my opinion, this meal was definitely tasty, but the flavors included were a little bit one-note. I'm placing this meal in C tier. Today, we are taking a look at the selection of Perry Edward Smith. On the evening of November 14th, 1959, Smith and his partner Richard Hickok snuck into the home of the Clutter family. The pair chose this house specifically because Smith's former cellmate in prison told him he used to work there as a farmhand, and the family had a safe filled with $10,000. However, after they searched the house, the duo not only ended up waking up the family, but it also became evident that said safe didn't exist. So, the two men decided to bind and gag the family of 4 and violently murdered them one by one. And although the pair managed to evade authorities for over 6 weeks, both men were eventually captured and sentenced to death by hanging. For Smith's final meal, he requested spiced shrimp, fries, garlic bread, strawberries with whipped cream, and ice cream. In my opinion, this spread had a solid collection of dishes and the variety wasn't bad. I'm placing this meal in A tier. Today, we're taking a look at the man who ordered one of the most expensive final meal requests in history, Robert Dale Conklin. On March 28, 1984, Conklin invited his lover, 28-year-old George Crooks, to his apartment. But shortly after he arrived, an altercation between the two broke out and Conklin stabbed him through the ear with a screwdriver, dismembered and disposed of his body, and blended up his internal organs in the garbage disposal. But in the end, Crooks' remains were still found and Conklin was sentenced to death by lethal injection. For his final meal, Conklin requested a bacon-wrapped filet mignon, garlic butter lemon shrimp, corn on the cob, a loaded baked potato, asparagus with hollandaise sauce, French bread with butter, goat cheese, cantaloupe, apple pie with vanilla ice cream, and iced tea. In my opinion, this meal was stacked with delicious dishes, a ton of variety, and as much quantity as you could want. I'm placing this meal in S tier. Today, we're taking a look at the selection of the death row granny, Velma Barfield. By the year 1977, Barfield had become addicted to prescription drugs, and each of her 2 prior husbands had passed away. But still, she'd go on to get a new boyfriend, and to fund her addiction, began forging checks and killing the people she had defrauded. However, eventually Barfield started to notice her boyfriend growing suspicious, so she mixed rat poison into his beer and tea, which ultimately killed him. In the end, it was discovered that Barfield had claimed the lives of 6 total victims, and thus, she was sentenced to death by lethal injection. For her final meal, Barfield requested just 2 prison canteen items, cheese puffs and Coca-Cola. The prison warden also knew that Barfield's favorite treat was a Kit Kat bar, so as a gift, he brought her one as well. In my opinion, this spread was definitely unique, but unfortunately, not unique in a good way. I'm placing this meal in D tier. Today, we are taking a look at the selection of Ruth Snyder. In the year 1915, 20-year-old Ruth married a 33-year-old artist named Albert Snyder. However, in the years following their marriage, things quickly began to go downhill. According to some theories, Ruth's resentment for Albert began when he hung up a picture of his late wife, named his boat after her, and described her as the finest woman he had ever met. So as revenge, Ruth persuaded Albert to purchase a life insurance policy that paid extra in the case of an unexpected act of violence. Then, Ruth made 7 failed attempts to kill him, but eventually succeeded by staging a burglary and strangling him with a picture wire. When she was caught, Ruth was sentenced to death by electrocution. For her final meal, Ruth requested chicken parmesan with Alfredo pasta, 2 milkshakes, ice cream, and a 12-pack of grape soda. In my opinion, though most of the meal was average, the pasta dish was top-notch. I'm placing this meal in B tier. Today, we are taking a look at the selection of the individual once known as the most hated man in the world, Bruno Hauptmann. On the evening of March 1st, 1932, Hauptmann kidnapped the son of the famous American aviator Charles Lindbergh from his home. Upon investigation, authorities found a homemade ladder under the window of the child's room, a ransom note for $50,000, and even the corpse of the infant child. But they still couldn't identify the perpetrator. Then when the case was at a seeming dead end, the FBI received a tip and used it to track Hauptmann down. And though Hauptmann realized he was being followed and tried to flee, he was captured and sentenced to death by electrocution. For his final meal, Hauptmann requested buttered peas, celery, chicken, french fries, cherries, olives, and a slice of cake. In my opinion, I'm normally a big fan of variety, but in this spread, some of the dishes were a bit questionable. I'm placing this meal in C tier. Today, we are taking a look at the selection of Joseph Mad Dog Taborsky. In the year 1950, Taborsky and his younger brother Albert robbed a liquor store and killed the clerk in the process. When they were caught, Albert testified against his brother to lower his own sentence, but as a result, Joseph was sentenced to death. But when Albert was in prison for the part he played in the crime, he was found to be mentally disabled and sent to an insane asylum. So when Joseph heard this news, he appealed his case, and because there were no other witnesses, he was freed from death row. Then upon being released, Taborsky befriended another mentally disabled felon who was known as Meatball Cologne. Together, they embarked on a series of 6 murders, but when caught again, Taborsky was sentenced for the second time to death by electrocution. For his final meal, Taborsky requested a big banana split and a cherry soda. In my opinion, banana splits are top tier when it comes to ice cream, but when it comes to entire final meal requests, I'm placing this meal in D tier. Today, we are taking a look at the selection of Andrew H. Brannan. On January 12, 1998, Deputy Kyle Dinkheller stopped Andrew Brannan when he was speeding down the highway at 98 miles an hour. At first, the traffic stop was nothing out of the ordinary. However, Brannan soon began refusing to take his hands out of his pockets, screaming at the officer to shoot him, and dancing in the middle of the road. And though Dinkheller continued trying to get him to comply, Brannan went to his truck to grab his M1 carbine, shouted that he was a quote, goddamn Vietnam combat veteran, and shot Dinkheller 10 times, resulting in his death. Because of these crimes, Brannan was sentenced to death by lethal injection. For his final meal, Brannan requested 3 over-easy eggs, hash browns, biscuits and gravy, sausage, pecan waffles with strawberries, milk, apple juice, and decaffeinated coffee. In my opinion, I wish there was a little bit more protein, but overall, this spread was solid. I'm placing this meal in A tier. Today, we're taking a look at the selection of Manuel Pardo Jr. In 1978, Pardo was just 21 years old when he began his career in law enforcement. However, this didn't last long. Within less than a year of starting, he was forced to resign when caught falsifying more than 100 traffic tickets, then got hired at a new station, but again was fired for this time lying to investigators. So when fighting crime didn't seem to work for him, Pardo decided to start committing it. And over the course of the next 4 months, he went on a spree of murder robberies and ultimately claimed the lives of 9 total victims. In the end, Pardo was sentenced to death by lethal injection. For his final meal, Pardo requested roasted pork, red beans, rice, plantains, tomato and avocado, olive oil, pumpkin pie, eggnog, and Cuban coffee. In my opinion, when it comes to selection, cohesion, and variety, this spread killed it. I'm placing this meal in A tier. I'm ranking every death row final meal request to find out which one's the greatest of all time. Today, we are taking a look at the selection of the Mad Dog Killer, Marion Albert Pruett. After testifying on a murder case in 1979, Pruett was placed in the Witness Protection Program, where he was given a new name and $800. However, rather than going into hiding with this new identity, he used this alias to embark on a spree of crimes. And in a series of murders that would go on to be known as the Mad Dog Killings, Pruett robbed and killed 3 convenience store workers, a bank teller, and his common-law wife, all to feed his severe cocaine addiction. And as a result of these crimes, Pruett was sentenced to death by lethal injection. For his final meal, Pruett requested a stuffed crust pizza, 4 Burger King Whoppers, French fries, fried squash, okra, an eggplant, a whole pecan pie, and 3 2-liter bottles of Pepsi. In my opinion, this spread had plenty of quantity, but it was a tad bit greasy for my preference. I'm placing this meal in A tier. Today, we're taking a look at the selection of the Candyman, Ronald Clark O'Brien. On Halloween of 1974, O'Brien took his children out for a night of trick-or-treating, and when the festivities came to an end, he brought out 5 tubes of pixie sticks to give to his kids and the other neighborhood children. And though none of the other children ended up eating any, Ronald's son Timothy did. But shortly after trying it out, Timothy began to convulse and vomit, and as Ronald held him in his arms, his body went limp and he died shortly thereafter. In the end, it was found that Ronald had laced this candy with cyanide, also he could collect an insurance claim on the life of his son, and thus he was sentenced to death by lethal injection. For his final meal, O'Brien requested a T-bone steak, French fries, corn, sweet peas, rolls, saltines, a salad, iced tea, and a Boston cream pie. In my opinion, though the spread had pretty standard dishes, the amount of quantity and variety was solid. I'm placing this meal in A tier. Today, we are taking a look at the selection of Walter Leroy Moody. On December 16, 1989, federal appeals judge Robert Vance was sitting in his kitchen when he began to open up a package he received in the mail. But just as he did so, there was a homemade pipe bomb inside the box that exploded, which killed him instantly and critically wounded his wife. Then, just 48 hours later, it happened again, thus killing attorney Robert Robinson as well. Although the search for the perpetrator was initially fruitless, an explosives expert recalled the striking similarity between these bombs and one he helped defuse 17 years prior, the maker of which was Walter Moody. So when the evidence mounted against him, Moody was sentenced to death by electrocution. For his final meal, Moody requested 2 Philly cheesesteaks, a bag of chips, 2 Dr. Peppers, a bag of M&Ms, and an almond Hershey bar. In my opinion, Philly cheesesteaks are scrumptious, but nothing else in this spread really stood out. I'm placing this meal in B tier. Today, we are taking a look at the selection of the Black Widow, Judy Buenoano. Beginning in 1971, all the loved ones in Buenoano's life gradually began to disappear. First, when her husband returned from his military service in Vietnam, he suddenly became ill and passed away shortly thereafter. Then the next year, the same thing happened to her new boyfriend. And a couple years after that, even her son would die under mysterious circumstances as well. But still, no one suspected a thing. But when her last fiance's car exploded with him behind the wheel, people grew suspicious. And in the end, it was found that Judy was responsible for all these deaths just so she could collect the life insurance policies on the victims. Thus, she was sentenced to death by electrocution. For her final meal, Buenoano requested steamed broccoli, asparagus, tomato wedges with lemon, strawberries, and hot tea. In my opinion, the spread did have some variety, but it certainly wasn't the kind I was looking for. I'm placing this meal in D tier. Today, we're taking a look at the selection of Christina Marie Riggs. On the night of November 4th, 1997, Riggs put both of her kids to bed, but tonight she gave them both some sedatives first to ensure they'd be sound asleep for her sinister plan. Then, once they finally dozed off, Riggs began by injecting her son with some stolen potassium chloride, the same toxic chemical used to perform lethal injections. However, this drug failed to kill him, so when the 5-year-old boy woke up in a state of terror, she smothered him with a pillow and then did the same to his 2-year-old sister. And although she then tried ingesting 28 sedative tablets to take her own life as well, this attempt failed and Riggs was sentenced to death by lethal injection. For her final meal, Riggs requested a supreme pizza, salad, pickled okra, strawberry shortcake, and cherry limeade. In my opinion, the spread wasn't anything special, but it definitely was solid all around. I'm placing this meal in A tier. Today, we're taking a look at the selection of Timothy Evans. In the year 1948, Timothy Evans and Beryl Thorley got married, but regularly quarreled and faced significant financial issues. So when Beryl revealed she was pregnant with a second child, the pair agreed to abort it. However, because abortion was illegal in the UK at the time, their downstairs neighbor John Christie volunteered to perform the procedure for them. But during this process, Beryl passed away, and when Timothy was interrogated on this case, he was coerced into falsely confessing and thus was sentenced to death by hanging. However, 3 years after Evans was executed, their downstairs neighbor John Christie was discovered to be a serial killer and had confessed to killing 6 victims, including Beryl Thorley. Therefore, Evans was posthumously pardoned. For his final meal, Evans requested steak, eggs, chips, and beer. In my opinion, this spread did have some solid items, but it was a little lacking in variety. I'm placing this meal in B tier. Today, we're taking a look at the selection of Sedley Alley. On July 11th, 1985, 2 Marines were on a jog near Millington Naval Base when they heard a scream in the distance. And although the pair ran toward the sound, by the time they arrived, all they saw was a car driving away from the scene. Then by the next morning, the body of 19-year-old Lance Corporal Suzanne Collins was found, and the autopsy of her corpse revealed that her skull had been fractured by a screwdriver and a 31-inch tree limb had been rammed into her genitals and punctured her lungs. In the end, although significant doubts surrounded his guilt due to the court's refusal to conduct DNA testing, former Marine Sedley Alley was sentenced to death by lethal injection. For his final meal, Alley requested frosted oatmeal cookies, pizza pockets, ice cream, and milk. In my opinion, I'm not sure if he intended to exclusively pick items that had a kind of whitish coloration, but it certainly didn't help the spread. I'm placing this meal in C tier. Today, we are taking a look at the selection of Ignacio Cuevas. On July 24th, 1974, Cuevas was serving a 45-year sentence for murder at the Huntsville prison when he and 2 other inmates decided they wanted to escape. So, the group bribed a prison worker to smuggle in guns and ammunition, and then they mounted an 11-day siege on the prison library and took 16 hostages. However, when the trio and 4 of their hostages made a break to a getaway vehicle, they ended up facing resistance, so they shot and killed 2 of their hostages along the way. In the end, the escape was unsuccessful, both his accomplices died, and Cuevas was sentenced to death by lethal injection. For his final meal, Cuevas requested chicken and dumplings, steamed rice, sliced bread, black-eyed peas, and iced tea. In my opinion, this spread is great for a standard dinner, but for a final meal, it's pretty average. I'm placing this meal in B tier. Today, we're taking a look at the selection of the last man publicly executed in the US, Rainey Bethea. On the morning of June 7th, 1936, Bethea snuck into the home of 70-year-old Lashia Edwards by climbing through her bedroom window. However, when he removed the window screen and entered into her room, this woke Edwards up. So when she looked up and saw Bethea, he choked her to death, brutally violated her, and stole her jewelry. But as he was fleeing the scene, he accidentally left a ring behind that would ultimately lead to his capture. In the end, Bethea provided a detailed confession of his guilt and was publicly hung before a crowd of 20,000 spectators. For his final meal, Bethea requested fried chicken, pork chops, mashed potatoes, pickled cucumbers, cornbread, lemon pie, and ice cream. In my opinion, between the multiple entrees, sides, and desserts, this spread was packed with some bangers. I'm placing this meal in A tier.